On the days before the emperor meant to hold a review, the soldiers showed great eagerness to make themselves tidy and clean up their weapons so as partly to conceal the destitution to which they were reduced. The most imprudent among them had cast off their winter garments in order to load themselves with provisions. However, they all took pride in making a good appearance at the reviews, and when the sun on fine days shone on the barrels of well-cleaned muskets, the emperor felt anew some of those emotions of which he was so full on the glorious day of the departure. The emperor left 1,200 wounded men at Moscow. 400 of these wretches were taken along by the last corps that quitted the city. Marshal Mortier was the last to leave it. At Femenskoye, 10 leagues from Moscow, we heard the noise of a frightful explosion. It was the Kremlin, blown up in accordance with the emperor's orders. Fireworks had been deposited in the vaults of the palace, and all had been calculated so that a certain time would elapse before the explosion. Some Cossacks came to pillage the deserted apartments in ignorance of the hidden fire beneath their feet. They were hurled to a prodigious height in the air. 30,000 muskets had been abandoned in the fortress. In 1 second, a part of the Kremlin was nothing but a mass of ruins. Another part was preserved, and what contributed not a little to enhance the reputation of their great Saint Nicholas with the Russians was that a stone image of that saint was spared by the explosion in a spot where the greatest ravages were made. This fact was afterwards reported to me by a person worthy of belief, who had heard it related by Count Rostovchin himself during a stay in Paris. October 28, the emperor resumed the road to Smolensk, passing near the battlefield of Borodino. Nearly 30,000 corpses had been left on these vast plains. On our approach, clouds of crows, which had been attracted by such abundant pasturage, flew far away from us with horrible croakings. These corpses of so many brave men had a disgusting aspect, being half devoured and exhaling an odor which the cold, already very keen, could not neutralize. The emperor had the march accelerated and went to spend the night in the nearly ruined chateau of Upenskoye. The next day, he visited some wounded who had remained in an abbey. These unfortunates, on seeing the emperor, seemed to recover their strength and forget their sufferings, which must have been horrible, the wounds becoming still more inflamed by the earliest frosts. All these pale, tired faces regained a certain serenity. The poor soldiers, pleased to see their comrades again, questioned them with anxious curiosity concerning the events that had followed the Battle of Borodino. When they knew that we had bivouacked at Moscow, they rejoiced with all their heart, and it was easy to see that what they chiefly regretted was to have been unable, like the others, to burn the finest movables of the rich Muscovites at their bivouac fires. Napoleon ordered that each carriage of the train should take along one of these unfortunates, and so it was done. All lent themselves to this work with an alacrity which greatly touched the emperor. The poor wounded men said with an accent of profound gratitude that they were far better off on these good cushions than in the ambulance wagons. We had no difficulty in believing it. A lieutenant of cuirassiers who had just had a limb amputated was put into the landau of His Majesty, who traveled on horseback. That replies to all the accusations of cruelty so causelessly charged upon the memory of a great man who is no more. I have read, but not without disgust, that the emperor sometimes had his carriage driven over wounded men whose cries of anguish did not touch his heart. All that is false and revolting. Not a single one of those who have served the emperor is so ignorant of his solicitude for the unhappy victims of war and the care he had taken of them. Foreigners, enemies, or Frenchmen, all were recommended to the army surgeons with equal interest. From time to time, frightful explosions would make us turn our heads to look behind us. They were caused by ammunition wagons, which were blown up to save the trouble of bringing them along. as the march was daily growing more difficult. It was painful to think that we were reduced to such a point of distress that we must throw our powder to the winds to save it from the hands of the enemy. But a still more sorrowful reflection occurred to the mind. With every detonation of this sort, the Grand Army must quickly extricate itself from ruin. Since the material of the expedition overloaded the men, and the number of arms employed was no longer in proportion to the labor, the 30th, the emperor had his headquarters in a wretched hovel without doors or windows. We had great difficulty in fencing off a little the spot he chose to sleep in. The cold was growing more severe, and the nights were freezing. The little fortified palisades, which were used as a kind of relays for the mail, and which, placed at regular distances, marked the divisions of the road, also served every evening as imperial headquarters. The emperor's bed was hastily put up, and a cabinet prepared as well as possible, in which he might work with his secretaries and write his different orders to the chiefs whom he had left on the roads and in the towns. Our retreat was sometimes harassed by parties of Cossacks. These barbarians would come upon us, lance in rest, and roaring like wild beasts rather than uttering human cries. Their little long-tailed horses brushed the flanks for the different divisions, but these reiterated attacks had not, at first at all events, disastrous consequence for the army. When we heard a hurrah, the infantry would put a good face on the matter, close up their ranks, and present bayonets. It was the cavalry's affair to pursue these barbarians, who fled faster than they had come. November 6th, before he had quitted the army, the emperor received tidings of the Malay conspiracy and all that related to it. At first he was astonished, then greatly displeased, and afterwards sneered a good deal over the discomfiture of General Savary, the minister of police. He said repeatedly that if he had been in Paris, nobody would have stirred, that he could not leave it without everybody losing their heads at the least rating. From this moment, he spoke frequently of the need of his presence in Paris. Apropos of General Savary, a little fact somewhat mystifying for him occurs to my memory. After having given up the command of the gendarmerie in order to succeed Fouché in the functions of Minister of Police, he had a brief discussion with an aide-de-camp of the emperor. As he threatened his interlocutor, the latter replied to him, "You think you will always have handcuffs in your pockets." November 8, it snowed. The day was gloomy, the cold severe, the wind violent, and the roads covered with sleet. The horses could not go forward. Their worn-out shoes could take no hold on this slippery ground. The poor animals were exhausted. It was necessary for the men to push the wheels in order to lighten their burdens in some degree. In the vigorous breathing that issues from the nostrils of a tired horse, in that tension of the hocks and those prodigious efforts of the reins, there is something that gives to a high degree the idea of force. But the mute resignation of these animals, when no one knows them, to be overburdened awakens pity and makes us repent of abusing so much courage. The emperor on foot in the midst of his household, a baton in his hand, walked with difficulty in these slippery paths, but he encouraged one and another with kindly words. We were full of goodwill. Whoever had then complained would have been badly received by all. We came in sight of Smolensk. The emperor was the least dejected. He was pale, but his face was calm. Nothing in his features betrayed his moral sufferings, for they would have needed to be violent for anyone to have perceived them in public. The roads were heaped with men and horses, dead of fatigue or famine. The men passed on, turning away their eyes. As to the horses, they were a good price for our famished men. At last we reached Smolensk. On the 9th, the emperor lodged in a fine house on the Place Neuve. Although this important city had suffered much since we were there, it still afforded resources. Provisions of every kind were found in it for the household of the emperor and the officers, but the emperor made no account of this privileged abundance, as one might call it, when he learned that the army lacked food and provender. At this news, he flew into a furious rage. Never did I see him depart so violently from his characteristic temper. He sent for the commissary who had charge of the provisioning and apostrophized him in such an unmeasured fashion that the latter turned pale and could not find a word in his own justification. The emperor insisted with still greater violence and allowed terrible threats to escape him. I heard the cries of an adjoining chamber. I learned afterwards that the commissary had thrown himself down at his majesty's knees to obtain his pardon. Calming down from his excitement, the emperor forgave him. Never, in truth, had he sympathized more keenly with the sufferings of his army. Never did he suffer more from his powerlessness to struggle against such multiplied misfortunes. On the 14th, we resumed the road we had passed over some months before under better auspices. The thermometer registered 20 degrees of cold. A wide space still divided us from France. After a slow and painful march, the emperor arrived at Krasnoy. He was obliged to go himself with his guard to meet the enemy in order to extricate the Prince Decmule. He passed through the enemy's fire, surrounded by his old guard, which serried about its chief, its platoons in which grape shot was making wide gashes. It is one of the grandest examples history gives us of the devotion and love of several thousand men for one alone. While the fire was hottest, the bands were playing the air. Where can one be better off than in the bosom of his family? Napoleon interrupted it, they say, by exclaiming, "Say rather, let us watch over the safety of the empire. It is difficult to imagine anything more grand." The emperor returned from this combat very much fatigued. He had passed several nights without taking any repose. Listening to the reports made him concerning the state of the army, expediting the orders necessary for procuring provisions for the soldiers, and putting in motion the different corps who were to sustain the retreat. Never had his inconceivable activity found more to do. Never also had his heart been so high as amidst all these misfortunes of which he seemed to feel the weighty responsibility. It was between Urka and the Dnieper that the carriages, for which there were no longer any horses, were burned. The tumult and discouragement in the rear of the army was so great that the majority of the laggards threw down their weapons there as a wearisome and useless burden. A sort of military police was exercised by order of the emperor to arrest the disorders so far as possible. The officers of the gendarmerie were charged to bring back by force those who abandoned their corps. Often they were obliged to prick them in the reins with their swords to make them go forward. The exceeding distress had so altered the soldierly spirit, naturally kind and sympathizing, that those who were most wretched intentionally spread confusion so as to wrest from their better clad companions either clothes or food. "There the Cossacks!" was, in general, their cry of alarm. When these culpable tricks were discovered and our soldiers recovered from their apprehension, reprisals were made, and then the tumult reached its height. The corps of Marshal Davout was one of the most maltreated in the army out of 70,000 men, of which it was composed. On setting out, not more than 4,000 or 5,000 were left, who were all dying from hunger. The marshal himself was enfeebled. He had neither linen nor bread. Want and fatigues of every kind had horribly emaciated his face. His entire person provoked pity. This brave marshal, who had 20 times escaped Russian bullets, beheld himself perishing with hunger. One of his soldiers presented him with a loaf of bread. He seized it and devoured it. He was one of those who contained himself the least. Wiping his mustaches where the frost had condensed, he would angrily rail against the evil destiny which had cast them into 30 degrees of cold. For moderation in speech is difficult enough when one is suffering so much. For some time the emperor had been in keen anxiety concerning the fate of Marshal Ney, who had been intercepted and obliged to cut his passage through the Russians following us on every side. His alarm increased as time went on. Every minute he would ask if no one had seen Ney, accusing himself of having exposed this brave general too much and inquiring after him as for a good friend whom one is lost. The entire army shared and manifested the same anxieties. It seemed as if this hero alone were in danger. Some regarded him as lost, and seeing that of the bridge Dnieper were menaced by the enemy, they proposed breaking them down. There was but one cry throughout the entire army against it. On the 20th, the emperor, whom this idea had cast into the utmost dejection, arrived at Basanomi. He was dining with Prince de Neuchâtel and Duc de Danzig when General Gourgaud came in haste to announce to His Majesty that Marshal Ney and his men were but a few leagues away from us. The emperor cried with a joy which is easily conceived, "Is it true?" Monsieur Gourgaud gave him details which were soon spread through all the camp. The news heartened everybody. The men eagerly accosted each other. It seemed as though everyone had found a brother. All were talking of the heroic courage he had displayed and the talents he had evinced in saving his troops. from the ice, the ravines, and the enemies. And it is true to say, to the immortal glory of Marshal Ney, that according to the opinions I have heard expressed by our most illustrious warriors, his defense is a feat of arms for which antiquity affords no parallel. The hearts of our soldiers throbbed with enthusiasm, and on that day they felt once more the emotions of the most splendid days of victory. Ney and his division have gained immortality by his prodigious effort of energy and valor. So much the better for the few survivors of that handful of heroes who can read the grand deeds that they have done in these annals inspired by them. His Majesty had several times said, I would give all the money I have in the vaults of the Tuileries if my brave Ney were at my side. It was Prince Eugène who had the honor of going to meet Marshal Ney with a corps of 4,000 veterans. Marshal Mortier had disputed this favor with him, for between these noble men there were never any but such noble rivalries. The danger was immense. The cannon of Prince Eugène was a signal understood by the marshal, who answered it by platoon firing. The two corps met and were not yet united when Marshal Ney and Prince Eugène were in each other's arms. They said, the latter wept for joy. Such traits make this horrible tableau appear somewhat less gloomy. As far as Berezina, our march was a mere succession of little combats and great privations. The emperor went one night at Kenaviki in a wooden cabin containing but 2 rooms. The back one was chosen for him, and the other all his attendants lay down pell-mell. I was more fortunate, for I lay in that of his Majesty, but several times during the night my duties obliged me to go into the other room, and then I had to stride over sleepers worn out by fatigue. Although I took great pains to not hurt them, they were so crowded that it was impossible not to set foot on legs or arms. In the retreat from Moscow, the emperor marched on foot, enveloped in his pelisse, and his head covered by a Russian cap, which was tied under his chin. I frequently marched near the brave Marshal Lefebvre, who had much affection for me. He said to me in his German French, in speaking of the emperor, he is surrounded by a heap of blackguards who do not tell him the truth. He does not make enough distinction between his good and bad adherents. How will he get out of that, this poor emperor whom I love? I am always in dread for his life. If nothing but my blood were needed to ensure it, I would spend it drop by drop. But that would not alter anything. And perhaps he may still have need of me. Chapter 1, Book 4. The day that preceded the passage of the Berezina was one of dreadful solemnity. The emperor seemed to have come to his decision with the cold resolve of a man who attempts a despairing deed. Nevertheless, a council was held. It was determined that the army should despoil itself of all useless burdens which might impede its march. Never was there more unity in the opinions. Never was deliberation more calm. It was the calm of men who commit themselves for the last time to the will of God and their own courage. The emperor had the eagles of all the corps brought together. They were burned. He thought there was nothing else for fugitives to do. It was a sad spectacle. These men stepping from the ranks one by one and throwing down what they loved more than their life. I have never witnessed dejection more profound, shame more bitterly felt, for this strongly resembled a general degradation of all the veterans of Moskva. The emperor had attached a talisman to these eagles. Then he made it too well understood that he no longer had faith in it. He must be very unfortunate to have come to that. At least it was a consolation for the soldiers to think that the Russians would have nothing but their cinders. What a picture was that of the burning of the eagles, especially for those who, like me, had been present at the magnificent ceremony of their distribution to the army at the camp of Bologna before the campaign of Austerlitz. Horses were lacking for the artillery, and at this critical moment the artillery was the safeguard of the army. The emperor gave orders that his horses should be taken. He estimated that the loss of even one cannon or artillery wagon would be incalculable. The artillery was confided to a corps composed entirely of officers. It amounted to about 500 men. It affected His Majesty to see these brave officers become soldiers once more, putting their hands to the pieces like simple cannoneers and going back through devotion to the lessons of the school. The emperor called, "This his sacred squadron, for the same reason which made the officers become soldiers. The other superior commanders descended from their rank without disturbing themselves about the designation of their grade. Generals of division Grouchy and Sebastiani resumed the rank of simple captains. Near Boazino, we were arrested by loud shouting. We thought ourselves cut off by the Russian army. I saw the emperor turn pale. This was a thunderbolt. Several lancers were dispatched as quickly as possible. We saw them return, waving their flags. His Majesty comprehended the signal, and long before we could have been reassured by the cuirassiers, he said, I bet that is the victor. So accurately present to his mind were even the possible positions of each corps of the army. Marshal Victor was, in fact, awaiting our passage with keen impatience. It seemed that his army had received some vague tidings of our misfortunes and was therefore prepared to give the emperor an enthusiastic welcome. His soldiers, still fresh and vigorous, at least in comparison with the rest of the army, could not believe their eyes when they saw us in such a miserable condition. The shouts of "Long live the Emperor!" resounded none the less on that account. But when the rear portion of the army began to defile before them, another impression was produced. A great confusion ensued. All those in Marshal's army who recognized any of their companions left their ranks and ran towards them, offering bread and clothes. They were frightened by the voracity with which these wretches ate. Many embraced each other, weeping. One of the brave and kindly officers of the Marshal took off his own uniform to give it to a poor soldier whose ragged garments exposed him naked to the cold, putting on his own back a tattered old infantry coat because he was more capable of resisting the rigors of the weather. If excessive misery withers the soul, on the other hand, it sometimes expands it to its highest point, as one may see. Many of the most wretched blew their brains out in despair in that act, the last which nature indicates to put an end to wretchedness. There was a resignation and coolness that made one shudder. Those who thus assailed their own lives were not seeking death so much as a term to insupportable sufferings. And in this disastrous campaign, I saw what vanities are physical force and human courage, where that moral force which is born of a determined will is non-existent. The emperor marched between the army of Marshal Victor and that of Marshal Oudinot. It was frightful to see these moving masses, sometimes halting progressively, the advance corps first, then those that followed, then the last, when Marshal Oudinot, who was ahead, suspended his march for some unknown time. There would be a movement of general uneasiness, then alarming speeches would begin, and as men who have seen everything and are inclined to believe everything, both true and false tidings, easily found credit. The fright would last until the front of the army began to move, when a degree of confidence was restored. By 5 o'clock in the evening of the 25th, some trestles had been fixed above the stream, constructed of wood beams taken from Polish cabins. It was rumored in the army that the bridge would be finished during the night. The emperor was much annoyed when the army deceived itself in this way, because he knew that people grow much more quickly discouraged when they have indulged in vain hopes. For this reason, he took great care to have the rear of the army made acquainted with the slightest incident, so as to never leave the soldiers under so cruel an illusion. The trestles gave way at a little past 5 o'clock. They were not strong enough. It was necessary to wait until the next day, and the army relapsed into its dismal conjectures. It was plain that next day it would have to sustain the enemy's fire, but there was no room for choice at the end of that night of anguish and sufferings of every sort. The first trestles were driven down into the river. People do not comprehend that the soldiers had stood up to their lips in water full of floating ice, summoning every force with which nature had endowed them, and all the remaining courage born of energy and devotion, in order to drive the piles several feet deep into a miry river bed, struggling against the most horrible fatigues, pushing away with their hands enormous masses of ice, which would have knocked them down and submerged them by their weight, fighting in a word, and fighting unto death with cold, the greatest enemy of life. Well, that is what our French poteniers did. Several of them were dragged down by the currents or suffocated by the cold. That is a glorious, seems to me, which outweighs many another. The emperor awaited day in a wretched hovel. In the morning he said to Prince Berthier, "Well, Berthier, how are we to get out of this?" He was sitting in his chamber. Great tears were rolling down his cheeks, which were paler than usual. The prince was near him. but they exchanged very few words. The emperor seemed overwhelmed with sadness. What was passing in his mind? I leave to the imagination. It was then that the king of Naples spoke frankly to his brother-in-law, entreating him in the name of the army to think of his own safety, the peril of being so imminent. Some brave Poles offered to form the escort of the emperor. They could go further up the Berezina and reach Vilna in 5 days. The emperor shook his head in a sign of refusal, but said nothing. The king understood, and there was no further mention of it. In great misfortunes, the least relief is doubly appreciated 1,000 times. I have observed this in the case of His Majesty and his unhappy army. On the banks of the Berezina, when the first supports of the bridge had scarcely been thrown out, Marshal Ney and the King of Naples rode up at full speed towards the emperor, shouting that the emperor had abandoned his positions. I saw the emperor, quite beside himself and unable to believe his ears, run at full speed to look in the direction which Admiral Chinichef was said to have taken. The news was true. The emperor, transported with joy and out of breath with running, exclaimed, I have tricked the admiral. This retrograde movement of the enemy, when he had so good a chance to crush us, was not easy to comprehend, and I do not know whether the emperor, in spite of his apparent satisfaction, was very sure about the happy results which were to accrue to us from this retreat. Before the bridge was finished, some 400 men were partially transported from the other side of the river on 2 memorable rafts, which they could with difficulty steer against the currents. From the shore, we saw them greatly shaken by the great pieces of ice which clogged the river. These masses would come to the very edge of the raft. Meeting an obstacle, they would stop for a while and then be drawn underneath those feeble planks and produce horrible shocks. Our soldiers would stop the largest ones with their bayonets and make them deviate insensibly beyond the rafts. The impatience of the army was at its highest pitch. The first to arrive on the other bank were the brave Monsieur Jacqueminot, aide-de-camp of Marshal Oudinot, and Count Predietsky. This was a brave Lithuanian whom the emperor greatly liked, especially when he shared our sufferings through fidelity and devotion. Both of them crossed the river on horseback. The army uttered shouts of admiration on seeing that its leaders were the first to give the example of intrepidity. There was, in fact, enough to disturb the strongest minds. The current forced the poor horses to swim obliquely across, which doubled the length of the passage. Then came the masses of ice, which strike against their chests and sides, inflicted piteous gashes. At 1 o'clock, General Legrand and his division blocked up the bridge constructed for the infantry. The emperor was on the opposite side. Several cannons got entangled in each other and stopped the march for an instant. The emperor sprang onto the bridge, put his own hands to the teams, and aided in freeing the pieces. The enthusiasm of the soldiers was extreme. It was to shouts of "Long live the emperor!" that the infantry landed on the other shore. Not long after the emperor learned that General Portneau had laid down his arms, he was keenly affected by the news and broke into somewhat unjust reproaches against the general. Later on, when better informed, he did full justice to the claims of necessity and despair. It is fair to say that this brave general did not take such an extreme step without having done all that a courageous man could do in such circumstances. It is permissible for a man to reflect when he can do nothing but allow himself to be killed to no purpose. When the artillery and the baggage were crossing, the bridge was so thronged that it broke. Then ensued that retrograde movement which crowded back in horrible confusion the whole multitude of stragglers who were advancing like driven cattle behind the artillery. Another bridge had been hastily constructed as if in sad prevision of the breaking of the first one, but the second one was narrow and unprotected at the sides. However, it was a makeshift, which at first glance seemed very precious in such an appalling calamity. But what miseries ensued! The laggards flocked thither in droves as the artillery, the baggage, in a word, the entire material of the army had been in advance on the first bridge. When it broke by the sudden recoil which took place and the catastrophe became known, then those who had been behind were the first to gain the other bridge. But it was necessary that the artillery should cross first. It pressed forward then with impetuosity towards the only way of salvation which was left. Here the pen refuses to describe the scene of horrors that took place. It was literally over a road of crushed bodies that the wagons of every sort reached the bridge. On this occasion, one saw what hardness, what systematic ferocity even can be imparted to the soul by the instinct of self-preservation. There were some of the stragglers, the craziest of any, who, wounded and even killed with bayonet thrusts, the unfortunate horses who did not obey the whip of their drivers. Several wagons had to be abandoned in consequence of this odious proceeding. I have said that the bridge had no ledges. At the sides, crowds of poor wretches who were trying to cross it were seen to fall into the stream and be sucked under the masses of ice. Others tried to cling to the miserable planks of the bridge and would remain hanging over the abyss until their hands, crushed by the wheels of the wagons, would let go their hold. Then they went to rejoin their comrades and were engulfed by the waters. Whole artillery wagons, horses and drivers alike, were plunged into the stream. Poor women were seen holding their children out of the water as if to retard their death by a few moments, and the most frightful of deaths, a truly admirable maternal scene, which the genius of painting has believed itself to divine in delineating the deluge of which we have seen the touching and terrible reality. The emperor wished to retrace his steps, hoping that his presence might restore order. He was dissuaded from this, and in a manner so significant that he struggled against the impulse of his heart and stayed where he was. And assuredly it was not his grandeur that riveted him to the shore. You could see what sufferings he endured when at every instant he would ask how the passage was getting on, if the cannons could still be heard rolling over the bridge, if there were fewer cries from that side. Imprudent people, he would say. Why could they not have waited a little longer? There were fine examples of devotion on this unfortunate occasion. A young artilleryman sprang into the water to save a poor woman who, encumbered by her 2 children, was trying to reach the other shore in a small boat. The load was too heavy. An enormous piece of ice struck the boat and it foundered. The cannoneer seized one of the children and swam to the shore with it. The mother and the other infant perished. This good young man brought up the little orphan as his son. I do not know whether he had the happiness of returning to France. Some officers harnessed themselves to sledges so as to fetch along a number of their companions who had been made helpless by their wounds. They wrapped the poor fellows up as warmly as possible, comforted them occasionally with a glass of brandy when any could be procured, and lavished on them the most touching affections. There were many who acted thus, and yet how many whose names are unknown! How few returned to enjoy their own country, the most beautiful memories of their life. The bridge was burned at 8 o'clock in the morning. The 29th, the emperor left the banks of the Berezina. We went to pass the night at Kamenn. There his majesty occupied a wretched wooden house. A freezing wind entered it on every side through broken windows, nearly every pane of which was shattered. We closed the apertures with trusses of hay. Not far away from us on a vast open space, the unfortunate Russian prisoners, whom the army was driving before it, were penned up like cattle. Truly, I found difficulty in comprehending that air of being victorious which our soldiers still assumed by dragging along a wretched superfluity of prisoners who could only hamper them by requiring superintendence. When the victors are dying of hunger, what becomes of the vanquished? Hence, these miserable Russians, worn out by want and marching, nearly all perished that night. In the morning, we saw them huddled close together. They had hoped to find a little warmth in this way. The feeblest of them had succumbed, and all night long their dead bodies had been embraced by the survivors without the latter having noticed it. There were some who, in their voracity, devoured their dead companions. The firmness with which the Russian endured pain has often been spoken of. I can give an instance of it which almost surpasses belief. One of these poor fellows, having wandered away from the corps to which he belonged, was struck by a cannonball, which cut off both his legs and killed his horse. A French officer, making a reconnaissance on the bank of the river where the Russian had fallen, perceived at a distance a mass which he recognized as a dead horse, and yet he saw that this mass was not without movement. He approached it and saw the head and shoulders of a man whose extremities were hidden in the body of the horse. The unfortunate man had been there 4 days, shutting himself up inside his horse as a shelter from the cold and feeding on infected scraps from this frightful lodging. December 3rd, we arrived at Malodechno. All day long, the emperor seemed thoughtful and quiet. He had frequent confidential interviews with his grand equerry, Monsieur de Caulaincourt. I suspected some extraordinary measure, nor was I deceived in my conjectures. At 2 leagues from Smorgoni, the Duke de Vicenza had me summoned and told me to go forward and give orders for the 6 best horses of the teams to be harnessed to my calash, which was the lightest of the carriages and kept constantly in the traces. I was at Smorgoni before the emperor, who only arrived at nightfall. The weather was excessively cold. The emperor alighted at a poor house in the place where he established his headquarters. He ate a light repast, wrote the 29th bulletin of his army with his own hand, and sent for all his marshals. Nothing had as yet transpired concerning the emperor's project, but in great and final measures there is always something unwanted which does not escape those who are clear-sighted. The emperor had never been so amiable, so communicative. He felt that it was necessary to prepare his most devoted friends for this overwhelming news. He talked for a long time of vague matters, and he spoke of the great things that had been done during the campaign, returning with pleasure to the retreat of Marshal Ney, whom they had at last found again. Marshal Davoust seemed thoughtful. The emperor said to him, "But talk a little, Marshal." For some days there had been a slight coolness between him and the emperor. His Majesty reproached him with the infrequency of his visits, but he could not dispel the cloud which lowered on all brows, for the secret had not been kept so well as he had hoped. After the repast, the emperor requested Prince Eugène to read the 29th bulletin. Then he frankly unbosomed himself about his plan, adding that his departure was essential in order to send assistance to the army. He gave his orders to the marshals. All were gloomy and discouraged. It was 10 o'clock in the evening when the emperor said it was time to go to rest. He embraced all the marshals affectionately and withdrew. He felt the need of this separation, for he had suffered greatly from the constraint of this interview. One might conclude so, at least, from the extreme agitation of his countenance after the council. About half an hour later, the emperor summoned me to his chamber and said, "Constant, I am starting. I thought I could take you with me, but I have reflected that several carriages would attract attention. It is essential that I should experience no delay. I have given order that you shall start at once after the return of my horses, so you will not be too far behind me." I was suffering greatly from my malady. That is why the emperor was unwilling to have me go on the seat as I requested, in order to be able to render him all the attentions to which he was accustomed. He said to me, "No, Constant, you will follow me in a carriage, and I hope you will arrive not more than a day at most after I do." He set off with the Duke de Vicenza and Rustem on the seat. The horses were taken from my carriage, and I remained behind, to my great regret. The emperor started in the night. By daybreak next morning, the army knew all. The impression produced by the news is indescribable. Discouragement was at its height. Many soldiers blasphemed and reproached the emperor for having abandoned them. There was a universal cry of malediction. Prince de Neuchâtel was in great anxiety and asking everyone if they had heard the news. Although he must have been the first to receive it, he feared lest Napoleon might be taken by the Cossacks, for he had an insufficient escort, and if his departure were known, no doubt great efforts would be made to capture him. On that night of the 6th, the cold increased. It must have been very great when we found birds lying frozen on the ground. Some soldiers who were sitting down, their heads in their hands and leaning forward so as to feel the emptiness of their stomachs somewhat less, fell asleep and were found dead in that position. When we breathed, the vapor of our breath congealed on our eyebrows. Tiny white icicles formed in the beards and mustaches of the soldiers. To get rid of them, they would warm their chins at the bivouac fires, and as one may fancy, a good many did not do so with impunity. The artillerymen held their hands to the nostrils of their horses, seeking a little warmth from the powerful breath of these animals. Their flesh was the ordinary nutriment of the soldiers. You could see them throwing large cuts of this meat on the coal, and as the cold froze it, it could be carried along without spoiling, like salted pork, the powder of the cartridge boxes, taking the places of salt. That very night we had with us a young Parisian belonging to a very wealthy family who had desired employment in the emperor's household. He was very young and had been received as one of the apartment waiters. The poor child was making his first journey. He had been attacked with fever as we were leaving Moscow, and he was so ill that night that he could not be taken from the wardrobe wagon in which he had been put until he should get better. He died there during the night, greatly regretted by all who knew him. Poor Lempriel was a charming character, very well taught, and the hope of his family. He was an only son. The ground was so hard that we could not dig a grave, and we experienced the grief of abandoning his remains without sepulchre. I set off the next day, provided with an order from Prince de Neuchâtel that I should be furnished with horses all along the route in preference to any other person. At the point beyond Smorgoni, which the emperor had left with the Duke de Vicenza, this order was of the greatest utility, for there were only horses enough for one carriage. I found myself competing with them with Count de Roux, who arrived when I did. I need not say that, but for the emperor's order to rejoin him as soon as possible, I could not have availed myself of my right to take precedence of the intendant general of the army. But, commanded by my duty, I showed Prince de Neuchâtel's order to Count de Roux, who, after examining it, said to me, "That is right, Mr. Constant, take the horses, but I entreat you, send them back to me as soon as possible." How disastrous was that retreat! After many pains and privations, we arrived at Vilna. It was necessary to cross a long and narrow bridge to enter the city. The artillery and baggage wagons so obstructed the space as to prevent all other vehicles from passing. It was all very well to say, "Service of the emperor." We were received with maledictions. Seeing that it was impossible to advance, I alighted from my calash and saw Prince D'Arenberg, an orderly officer of the emperor, in a pitiable condition. His face was distorted, his nose, ears, and feet were frozen. He was sitting down behind my carriage. I was heartbroken. I said to the prince, if he had acquainted me with his distress, I would have given my place. He could scarcely answer me. I supported him for some time, but seeing how urgent it was for both of us to go forward, I concluded to carry him. He was slight, supple, and of medium height. I took him in my arms, and with this burden, elbowing, pushing, hurt, and hurting, I at last arrived and deposited the prince at the headquarters of the King of Naples, advising that he should be given the care demanded by his condition, after which I looked out for my carriage. We lacked everything. Long before reaching Vilna, the horses being dead, we had received orders to burn our carriages with all they contained. I lost considerable in this journey. I had made several costly purchases. All were burned with my effects, of which I had always a great quantity on my journey. A large part of the emperor's effects were burned in the same way. A very fine carriage belonging to Prince Berthier, which had just arrived, had not yet been used, was also burned. 4 grenadiers were stationed at each fire, who with presented bayonets were to prevent anyone from taking what must be sacrificed. The next day, the carriages which had been spared were examined to see that no luggage of any sort was left in them. All I was able to keep were 2 shirts. We slept at Vilna, but the alarm was given early the next day. But the Russians were at the gates of that city. Frightened men arrived shouting, "We are lost!" The King of Naples, rudely awakened, sprang from his bed, and in an instant orders were given that the service of the emperor should set off at once. I leave to the reader's imagination the confusion that all this occasioned. There was no time to make any provision. We were obliged to start without delay. Prince D'Arenberg was put into one of the king's carriages, with whatever could be procured for the most pressing needs. Hardly had we left the city when we heard loud cries behind us and discharges of cannon, accompanied by quick volleys and musketry. We had to ascend a mountain of ice. The horses were fatigued. We made no progress. The treasure wagon was abandoned, and part of the money was stolen by men who, 100 paces further on, were obliged to throw away what they had taken in order to save their lives.